Hello, everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Trauma Talk. I'm your host, Julie Boswell-Livingston, and I'm so glad you're here. Today, we're embarking on a journey together, the first leg of our journey through trauma and recovery from trauma. You can think of your trauma as baggage. That's one way to look at it, I guess, that baggage that you've collected over the years, because kind of what it is. We're carrying around all of this unresolved trauma from our childhood with us. And it's constantly being triggered without our conscious awareness, causing all kinds of damage and harm to our lives and especially to our families and the people that live around us. You know that little area at the airport where you collect your luggage, the baggage carousel? Well, we pick ours up every day right after we get out of bed. We don't have to go look for it, and there's no fear of anyone stealing it. But we carry it around with us nonetheless. A lot of times I think I already dealt with my emotional baggage, and I'm very surprised every time when it shows up again because I thought I would never see it. Thought I'd already taken care of it, buried it deep, deep down, and it could never make it back up to the surface. Sometimes it surprises me and it comes back up and surfaces again. Just when you thought you'd killed something, right? It takes great courage, I think, to jump into trauma recovery. But once you feel the freedom and joy of the first release, you'll get hooked on it. You'll get hooked on the idea of doing it again and again until you reach like that Zen point or the ultimate stage on the Buddhist wheel. So today we'll embark on a journey to learn to release that old trauma and its impact on our lives, a subject that resonates with all of us, consciously or unconsciously. Seems like I've been studying trauma myself for my entire life, and maybe that's how I ended up getting a PhD in international psychology with the focus on trauma and trauma treatment. I've discovered through that journey that trauma isn't an isolated event. It seeps into the fabric of our everyday lives, and it typically emerges in ways we can't even begin to fully understand. It's something that we all experience. It's a part of being human. Often we experience childhood trauma without even recognizing it or understanding it. Um, so many people will say, I had a really good childhood and I experienced any trauma in my childhood, thinking that childhood trauma is just physical abuse or sexual abuse and that they haven't been traumatized, but that's not true. Um, all the little things that happen in childhood cause trauma too. And it can be triggered from past events that completely catch us off guard. And those seem to have the most profound effects on our lives. But sometimes it's just combined with the stress of dealing with everyday life. Trauma triggers can stir up memories we thought we'd buried. So they ignite a stress response in our brains that can feel overwhelming, and yet it's all too familiar. But the minute that vagus nerve switches on and it activates, it says fight, flight, freeze, fawn. And our bodies respond because the brain is sending that message. In times of stress, our minds slip into what's known as survival mode, even when we haven't consciously decided to enter that state. And let's talk about this thing called the vagus nerve. It's operated by the central nervous system in our bodies, which is aligned with every organ in the body, and the amygdala, which is the fear center of the brain, and the hippocampus, where your memory is stored in the brain. Have you heard about the vagus nerve? Um, I personally think all children should learn about the vagus nerve and how to calm themselves. The earlier, the better. The echoes of past traumas can pre-program our responses, influencing how we navigate life, often without our own conscious awareness. So if you find yourself in a particularly overwhelming phase of life right now, whether it's moving, welcoming a new child, starting a new job, going through a divorce, any of the million of other transitional stresses that you might be experiencing, this might not be the ideal time to start this journey. Those kinds of transitions can be traumatic in their own right. And it's vital with trauma to focus your energy where it's most needed. That said, many of us use these life changes as a way to avoid dealing with deeper issues. I spent years myself personally running from my childhood trauma, relegating those memories to the shadows of my mind and convinced that keeping them hidden would spare me reliving the pain. Just remember that avoidance rules the day with trauma. It's a natural human instinct to shy away from pain or the discomfort of dealing with old wounds because they bring up pain. We're wired as human beings to escape pain, avoid it at all costs, right? Like refraining from walking barefoot into a fire. Our brain instinctively signals us to protect ourselves. Another drawback is that some of us learn that sharing personal stories or our feelings or our struggles, our traumas, needs to be reserved only for those who we trust the most. And even then, it often takes being completely overwhelmed to share just a sliver of our burden with trauma. But in reality, to cultivate a healthy balance in our lives, we must work consistently towards releasing the entire weight of our negative experiences. So, as we embark on this journey together through trauma, I invite you to maintain an open heart and mind. Healing is a process, and understanding the role of trauma in our stories is the first step towards resilience and recovery. Let's explore together. We're kind of here to dig into the tough stuff, right? That's childhood trauma, intergenerational trauma, and all the good stuff in between. I've been researching the topic of trauma for the last decade, and I've had the opportunity to work with amazing people all over the world. I did my research on intergenerational trauma with the women of the Paul First Nation band in Canada. And I'm working on a new treatment model for trauma that combines the cultural teachings of Indigenous North American people with Western therapy techniques. Spoiler alert, the medicine wheel has a starring role here. Trauma is a term that's been tossed around in conversations, articles, and even social media. But let's discuss what it truly means. To understand trauma, we first need to look back at our history, to the moments that brought this whole concept into the public consciousness in significant ways. And those are the world wars. In the aftermath of World War I, soldiers returned home profoundly changed, struggling with all the traumas that they experienced in that carnage on the battlefield, with what was then called shell shock. This condition was characterized by psychological distress, manifested through symptoms like anxiety, nightmares, and emotional numbness. It must have been just awful after these men had fought so valiantly to come home with the psychological scars that they brought that were just as crippling as any of the physical wounds that they came home with. Still, society refused to recognize and address the issues of war trauma as being real, and instead they attributed it to weakness rather than to admit it was the brutal realities of war. Fast forward now to World War II, where when soldiers were being recruited for battle, it was put out that they didn't want any recruits that were weak of character. And um, the horrors of the Battle of the Second World War became even more pronounced. And with that came a more subtle understanding, I guess, of like psychological pain and how they labeled that as combat fatigue. Now, later, that evolved into what we recognize today as PTSD, or post traumatic stress disorder. With each war, the conversation around trauma slowly began to grow, yet society often still treated the subject as taboo. Instead of embracing their painful experiences and their need for healing and giving them just that, a time to heal, a place to heal, and someone to guide them through the healing process. Instead, they were taught to hide them behind a veil of silence and shame. They were taught that they were weak and that it was shameful. Culturally, we've had a tendency to kind of stigmatize any emotional suffering and all the mental health challenges. I can't tell you the number of things that I've heard people say about depression or addiction. It's just not accepted in our society. We are thought of as weak. We are thought of as broken. But many of us have been taught that any kind of vulnerability is a weakness, and that confronting painful memories makes us broken, weak people. So it's no wonder, with all this societal avoidance, that this has led to generations of us before that had to bury their trauma deep, creating a cycle that naturally led to debilitating consequences. The belief that we must bear our burdens alone, while always projecting an image of strength, has resulted in widespread neglect of the very real human pain that's experienced in trauma and silence. Ignoring the impact of trauma has led to a country filled with people struggling internally, unaware of the depths of their emotional wounds or how to heal from them. You need not look too far to see how trauma has manifested itself in our society. Addiction, anger, rage, depression, and chronic illness are just a few. We've become experts at masking our pain with distractions and avoidance. If trauma, or this kind of psychological trauma, happened in the physical field of medicine, it would be equal to putting a Band-Aid on a deep, gaping wound and thinking, okay, that'll take care of it. Of course it won't. Among the many types of traumas, childhood trauma is considered the most damaging. Childhood trauma includes experiences, so many experiences, such as sexual, physical, emotional, or mental abuse. Those are the big ones. Neglect, witnessing violence as a child, witnessing a divorce, witnessing a parent's addiction, having a parent that's incarcerated, living in poverty, all of these things, all of this stuff that takes place in childhood creates trauma. The foundational understanding of childhood trauma is that it occurs during the critical developmental stages of a child's life. And that's when children need parents. They need somebody that can rush in to be there for them, to comfort them, to let them know that they're safe, to let them know they're all right, to let them give them guidance on how to take the next step. But instead, we have parents that are so traumatized themselves and so stressed themselves, they have no idea of how to do that because that wasn't done for them. Children are not only processing their experiences, but also at the same time, they're internalizing all the negative beliefs about themselves that they're having in this world when they experience trauma. This, of course, interferes with the healthy development and of a child, and it plays a significant role, I think, in shaping an individual's future, their mental health future, and the coping strategies that they're able to use. They're often never taught coping strategies. Childhood trauma is usually the purveyor of inescapable pain and thinking one's not good enough to enjoy happiness or success in life. It's crucial to recognize that trauma isn't just a personal issue, it's a societal one. The more we acknowledge it, the more we advocate for healing and understanding. By sharing our stories, offering support, and embracing vulnerability, we can begin to dismantle the stigma surrounding trauma and start developing a culture that prioritizes emotional well-being just as much as physical well-being. As we dig into discussions about trauma in this podcast, we'll explore not just their historical context, but also our collective responsibility to break this cycle of silence and shame. It's time for us to confront these painful truths with honesty and compassion, paving the way for healing, both individually and collectively. Now, if you're like many people, you might have learned that avoiding pain is a skill that's practically trained into us from when we're children. And while it might keep us safe and snug as a bug in a rug, it can lead to some serious issues later on in life, like debilitating illnesses, unhappiness, and let's be real, a whole lot of anger, rage. Ever feel like a volcano just waiting to erupt in you over the smallest inconvenience? Yeah, I see you. So, what often happens is that we find clever, creative ways to sabotage ourselves. Procrastination becomes our best friend. And suddenly, cleaning the garage feels more urgent, more important than confronting that lingering childhood trauma. I mean, who hasn't experienced that moment where suddenly every little task becomes a mountain? Oh, my childhood trauma is calling. But first, let me rearrange my sock drawer again. But here's the truth, that little voice urging us to procrastinate is really just our inner child trying to protect us. It's screaming, no, no, not today, my friend. Yet that same voice doesn't realize that avoiding these triggers won't make them go away. They're kind of like glitter. Once it's out of the bottle, it doesn't really ever leave. It's just everywhere forever. So instead of just collecting all this glitter in our lives, we need to learn how to create beautiful art from it. We need to transform pain into growth. Throughout this podcast, we'll address these daunting topics with honesty, humor, and a whole lot of heart, I hope. I want to create a safe space where we can all confront these truths together, even if that means facing some uncomfortable realities along the way. So, whether you're a seasoned trauma warrior or just starting to dip your toes into this deep pool of understanding, welcome aboard. Together, we'll explore how trauma has shaped us, how we can heal from it, and how we can ultimately reclaim our lives and rewrite our narratives. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. Stay tuned for insightful interviews, stories that inspire, and yes, humor that lightens the load. On the next podcast, I will be joined by a Native American healing woman from the Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana. So until next time, remember, healing isn't linear, and that's totally okay. Let's embrace these turns and occasional glitter explosions together. I'll see you next time.